Here we are finally, Calamity Death Mode ZENITH Legendary Difficulty, Hard Mode Edition. This is the second part of a 4-part series that will be the most interesting way of playing Terraria, and if you didn't know, now you do. And up on the right is a link to the first part for all of pre-hard mode. Now then, with the Wall of Flesh beaten, there are some interesting changes happening. The moment hard mode starts does the Hallowed spawn, but thanks to the interesting world generation of the ZENITH, it will be hard to find it on the surface. At the same time, it's the most important part of the Hallowed that it gives Souls of Light, while the Eater of Worlds had the interesting gimmick added of dropping light discs instead of shadow scales. Combine that with the interesting recent base Terraria edition of Shimmer that can not only turn items into new ones, but has also the interesting function of decrafting. Do we not need to grind for Souls of Light? That is not true for Souls of Night. However, is this not a problem, thanks to the spawn rate of enemies in corrupted biomes being raised to quite an interesting level. Add a Zerg potion to that, and we get this interesting spectacle. The most important reason why we need Souls of Light was indeed just because we wanted to get the mech summons. But this seed has the interesting addition that you can actually not use them, and instead can craft the most interesting remove feature from old console games. In this world we will find Okram instead. Trust. This is Okram, just how he was back in the day. In addition are also all the random mech spawns replaced with this. Another quite interesting thing are new blood moons that have now far more interesting enemies than in pre-hard mode. Now, let's talk about an interesting change Calamity did to hard mode ore spawning. Normally you would smash altars to get them, but Calamity made it so that they are locked behind beating the mechs, which do not exist in this world. But there is another interesting and thrilling way of getting them, via fishing. With how much corruption is everywhere, is it not hard to get a fight crate? Drop hard mode ores regardless of Calamity's interesting changes. But you won't see me go through this interesting adventure. Now, some more interesting changes to hard mode. When hard mode starts, the accessory refines get revamped. So pre-hard mode bosses are now way easier than you would expect them to be. Despite that, was my first goal to go after what the Desert Scourge unlocked. In the Sunken Sea, there's now a new boss spawn that drops stuff needed for some upgrade. This boss may even have a quite interesting name if you look closely at it, as it is Supreme Calamitas. Very interesting name indeed. I expected more from the boss named after the mod itself. Now, even more interesting changes from hard mode. They just keep coming. Calamity added another interesting addition to hard mode, as now next to the Hallowed does also the Astral Infection generate, but we will not do much with it for now. Then there are also some interesting things I couldn't tell you where they come from, why they are there, and if they are hard mode stuff. While this is mostly Calamity, did I also add Thorium and Quirdies to this for some more interesting options along the way, even if Calamity basically always beats them out after the first 3 hard mode boss. What you might also have noticed is the interesting addition I gave you during the Supreme Calamitas fight. There will be situations where it would be hard to see what happens in the style I am doing this, as this is some amount of hours compressed to one. Interested in how many? I'm not gonna tell you for now. For that you will need to watch more. Anyways, the markers I added are mostly for bosses, but the one interesting thing that isn't a boss that happened to me are jungle mimics. Did you know they existed? I can tell you they are sure interesting, especially with their only having spawned 2 biomimics that aren't jungle on me during all of this time. Very interesting indeed. You should already have seen it by now, because I had so many interesting things to say that I couldn't time it right, but while searching for the underground Hallowed did I find the wizard. I will do melee for everything, as Calamity had the interesting balancing choice of making everything have such interesting comparisons to melee weapons and equipment, but it's still a good thing to have the option. During my Hollow Search expedition splitting the world in half, did I then find the temple. Still a while off, and with the interesting addition of you not being able to hammer, or using wiring on the temple pre-Golem, so you can't get inside early, is what I would say if Calamity didn't have the interesting idea of letting you craft the temple key this easily. Inside the temple I found the most interesting addition to specifically ZENITH Calamity. Calamity had once this interesting joke boss of the Law that was just a dungeon guardian on the interesting stuff. But now he's back and fightable without having to resort to interesting strategies. He does have the interesting AI of disabling all equipment, together with having random boss AI, as the Law drops No You, an item that makes you invincible, if that is still how it works. So this will be the last boss I will attempt. Back to temple exploration. There aren't many interesting things you can get, as Golem can only be summoned after Planterra, but solar tablets are interesting for one thing: the solar eclipse changes on what bosses have been defeated. But the one thing I was most interested in was the seashell for a moon shell. Yet I still have not found the thing you are supposed to do first when entering hard mode, so the Hallowed search continues. After a while then I find then the Hallowed, in this interesting situation where I had corrupted areas spawn Hallowed enemies and crystals. Deeper in it then was not just Hallowed but also Shimmer, so this really was an interesting Hallowed biome if I have ever seen one. Now it's time for hard mode bosses. Pyrogen has an interesting change that I could not explain you why Pyrogen of all bosses got this change, but he is now Pyrogen. This makes the fight far more interesting than it usually is. Another interesting thing about Okram is that you can spawn him during a time where he enrages, as he enrages at the end of night and not during daytime. This was something I did not know at first, so it gave me an interesting experience with my first time fighting Okram. I knew the general idea of Okram, but I never fought him. I then sought to get an upgrade to one of the most interesting weapons in Calamity. While this is at the moment the broken Bioblade and won't get used, does it work the same way it will later by changing how it works based on what biome you charge it in. There's one interesting biome for this that I will yet not tell you, but I am sure the answer will be more interesting than you would expect. So it's time for you to guess that one for your own. Of the bosses of hard mode is Queen Slime the easiest, and that would be true for this if the world wasn't in such an interesting state. But while test fighting her did I realize that she has the same interesting AI her husband had, and would not back down from a fight like royalty should. So I did try fight her with the same interesting strategy I'd had for King Slime. But as it would seem, for phase 2, that honor gets lost, so skip her for now. And for those who wanted to know, as I had to know in my most interesting times, this is how Okram is supposed to look. If you may have not realized it by now, in fact I do not have some interesting mod to let me zoom out more. Up to this point did I not even fight Okram long enough to have his entire body move, as there is an interesting size change done to him. I guess that's one of those interesting cases of 5'9" to 6 feet, or however that one goes, as I'm not one of the more interesting 1.5% of nations out there. I was thinking that my interesting arenas would be fitting for this fight, before I knew what was coming, so in the end did I need to make this interesting arena, and I will leave it up to you to guess if this arena is big enough for Okram. I will get to that later, as I now ping-ponged to the other objective I could go after in hard mode. I thought I would mostly ignore the abyss for this, but it happened to have some interesting things I wanted. Also does it give off this interesting sound when mined at 8 times speed. Very interesting construction noises ASMR. I will now tell you the one thing I have always and will always do in Terraria, and that is my interesting philosophy of if there is an ocean that can have a tunnel connecting it to hell, there has to be one. The abyss, on the other hand, is not such a pushover that would be the end of it, as I would come to realize later. The abyss has an interesting gimmick of respawning water within its tides that don't have any, so we now have an infinite water drain versus infinite water supply. That gave some interesting states the abyss had over the different times I watched it. And if you wanted to know how long it takes to go through a large world sample, it's about that long, when it's already lit up. Some interesting fact I found out far too late was that if you zoom in, gets the traversal of this tight space extremely easy. Another interesting strat I developed at some point was to simply never touch the ground, to never trigger the pressure plates. Quite the interesting revelation I had there. You should also keep in mind how I light out the entire Golem room. This will be something to look out for when fighting Golem. Now, with the state Okram is in, I thought on taking on a more interesting boss. Despite not being able to mine chlorophyll, could I make a good enough arena for Planterra? Many people think of Planterra as this difficult boss, but honestly, I don't see why. The first phase is trivial, the second, while more interesting, still not that hard. While then being there, digging out the Planterra arena, I at one point stumbled upon a definitely interesting edition of Calamity, to spawn a pre-made Planterra arena that has respawning books inside of it. That gave me the idea of simply trying it. Despite not having fought this in years, did I get quite easily to phase 2. That it has a quite interesting change to make all the tentacles surround the main body instead of the normally interesting add-on to her feet to make mobility harder. I even set up a teleporter system, just to not to have to avoid the now far more interesting hitbox of Clam when adding in all the tentacles. So this surely would be smooth sailing towards the kill. Oh, clearly just some coincidence. Some interesting AI to prevent you from exploiting this mostly contact-based boss AI. Oh, this does not look like some coincidence, but extremely planned. Back to Okram, and for that I want to point out this exact frame where I got hit. If you wonder, no, there wasn't a projectile. This is contact damage. From what? Well, this interesting change of making Okram big does not show the true scale of how big he really is. This is his actual hitbox, as it seems to be. After seeing this in editing, did I pay more attention to this interesting quirks that I did not realize were playing, and I saw that there were far too many interesting happenings caused by this larger than visual hitbox. So if you thought that the arena I made for Okram was big, I have to tell you that it was actually too small, by a lot. So for now let's clear out the brain, which still is as interesting as it was in pre-hard mode, especially with its second phase forcing you into reverse gravity. But with the hard mode buff the player gets, was there not much difficulty. And directly after that did I have the interesting decision to simply win against Okram. It really was that easy all along. For this fight I have to mention the Nimbus Rod. While this talk will mostly be left for the fourth sum up video, where I want you to know just how good it is exactly against Okram due to his massive body being at all times inside it, which melts through him like nothing else. Then some other interesting AI changes are that the head periodically charges at you and wants to get above you before starting to spin. With how interesting the hitboxes are to this, do you need to get a feel for when that happens and plan movement around that. Then just having something solid to circle around to prevent 2/3 of the projectiles being fired, with the last one being exclusive to the spin, makes this just a case of you needing to overcome the interesting challenge posed by the hitbox being widely different from looks. That now means we can make the hallowed pick to mine the green stuff. Glorified isn't strictly spoken an upgrade to hallowed armor due to the interesting set bonus hallowed gets. However, is glorified in the end the best armor for all of hard mode melee due to the highest damage multiplier and the periodical AoE. What also is now doable with having a hallowed pick is to invade the deepest part of the abyss from the side, not having to deal with breath as much. But even then did I need to resort to the Arctic diving gear, which is not meant to get you to the bottom, but I had this interesting sword shard to get there, so it was enough to get an interesting item that I will use once and never again. So that is when we can talk about it. I still have not defeated the Aquatic Scourge, and while that will not happen now, do I want you to know that the Aquatic Scourge has an interesting hobby of writing sonic fanfic, so his favorite move is to start to spin in place and never stop. This would make this fight free, if not for the other interesting gimmick I, even now after having defeated him, don't understand. What he does is to do sulfuric poison DOT, but at the same time does that sometimes get reset before damage, so I have no idea how this works, but it makes the fight for now impossible, as there isn't enough damage to finish him off before this new interesting addition of a timer runs out. It was time for one more new and interesting arena for the Hallow. That was quite the interesting size of spanning from the Shimmer Lake near the surface to the underground Hallow. Perfect to be tested out on Queen Slime. And there isn't anything interesting to say here. Just get good. And this fight is done. I'm pretty sure there are no interesting additions being done to this fight from how it normally would go. Not that I would know it, never having fought her before. After that did I just test out the terminus obtained from the deepest part of the abyss, and I can right now say I will not do this again. They sought to make boss rush more interesting by increasing the HP of bosses by about 50 times, and that also includes all enemies spawned by those bosses, all to get nothing of worse in the end. Instead of that interesting thought experiment, let's do something of worse, by enlarging the Planterra arena, as it was indeed too small. The tentacles around plants spread out when damaged, which means there just isn't enough space in the pre-made arena. You can now also see the first of the two-step part that is mandatory to beat Planterra. I'm not exaggerating here, as the second phase does have the interesting part of being on a 5-second timer that will instantly kill you when you can't be near to all the tentacles beforehand. And on legendary death mode there simply isn't enough damage possible to do that. That means you are forced to use Adrenaline and Rage for the massive damage multiplier the moment the second phase starts. But you also need an extremely interesting weapon for this, that I won't mention for now. There are still more bosses you can challenge at this point, in Anahita and Leviathan, which are interesting in the fact that their sizes are reversed, so that the one that constantly charges at you has a hitbox the size of the screen. Then there is the other ocean boss, in Duke Fishron, which sure is interesting in death mode, changing to being far more aggressive and faster. But I have to say the most interesting part of this fight is the strong moon gravity that makes it like you are moving on extremely slippery ice while only having the ability to instantly change direction left and right with the help of a dash, while it is nearly impossible to move down fast enough to evade anything. That interesting change made me realize that there is not much worth of even attempting this fight, and that has the interesting consequence that magic is completely off the table, with the Razorblade Typhoon being the only weapon appropriate for this far more interesting hard mode. We are now almost done with the show of bosses you can fight at the moment. The Calamity clone is still on the table, and this boss has just one interesting change due to death mode that also some could argument makes this a completely different boss that interestingly is listed as pre-Planterra, when I can tell you for certain that this is not a pre-Planterra boss. After that is a Brimstone Elemental that I couldn't tell you what interesting changes are added with death mode, but it didn't have anything of interest that would make me try to beat it. Another one of the bosses at this point would be the plate wearer Goliath, who has this interesting death mode trick of charging at you and leaving behind honey in its path, which means any arena you fight him in will slowly become extremely interesting to traverse. The last boss left is the Astrum Aureus, who sure is one of the bosses of all time. That meant I decided to go after Calam Clone, and if you see an interesting amount of unicorns in this fight, that's because I tried to do an iframe views, but Calamity probably has set all boss projectiles at max priority, so you really can't flood the screen with weak enemies to avoid being damaged by the boss. Having now spent an interesting amount of time trying to beat Calam Clone, did I swap back to Clam, and well, you won't see me beat her, because of how many things I had to do during this fight at the same time. That something interesting happened when I was about to win, that you will probably understand why I took a break afterward, and then forgot to press record again. So let's talk about what is mandatory to do in this. First phase, just do whatever, but make sure you have Adrenaline and Rage charged up before phase 2 starts. And yes, that does mean it's mandatory to do this without getting hit. If you can't even do phase 1 of planned hitless, why would you even bother trying to do this? Then for phase 2 it's time to use the best form of the Biome Blade, which is in fact Hollow. All forms are interesting on their own right, but all others in some form affect your movement, which is an interesting thing to do during boss fights in which you want the most precise movement you can get. What you also need to do is, and best before phase 2 starts, to charge up to max speed before you attack. After that do you need to go in a way where you plow through all tentacles surrounding plant while Alpha Rage is up, as this is the only thing that has the damage output necessary to beat the interestingly large amount of HP the tentacles have for instantly killing you about 5 seconds after phase 2 starts, moving at an interesting speed that would be about twice as fast as you can be at this point. And I should also mention that I have only accessories that increase damage and boost with menacing on all reach forges, just to have barely enough damage for this. After that you just need to clear out the occasional tentacles that spawn, and this fight is done. Quite the interesting battle plan, I have to say. I assume if you could get the Razorblade Typhoon at this point, would you also go mage, as that should be strong enough for this. After that was Pyrogen. Not even all that hard anymore. But the cryonic ore will for now not be relevant. But this is a boss you should check off. With that, let's get to my first ever encounter with the Empress of Light. When she got introduced, I searched for about an hour for her extremely interesting spawning requirement before giving up playing Terraria up to now. So all I know of her is some far and few between shows of others fighting her. She is seen as the hardest base game boss, but let's see to that when I beat her. At first you will finally go after Calamity's clone, and for this boss you should simply look at the fight. I can't find words that would accurately describe how interesting this fight is. I will have my 1 or 9 words on this fight in the sum up 4th video, but just keep in mind that this is about twice as hard as it looks when you are the person who needs to do this. But I have to say, I did go through hours of attempts just on the same boss over and over. But sometimes there's also a recording that starts like this, which just proves that I am best when doing something for the first time. At last can we go to beat Golem, and you might remember me saying to keep in mind how I light up the Golem room. As you can see, none of that is here, as light sources inside the Golem room apparently get removed over time. I couldn't tell you where that interesting ambition is from, but what you should, because of there being no light, not really be able to see is that Golem is now teeny tiny and far more mobile. I assume he simply removed the torches because he is too embarrassed on how weak he is despite all the interesting things that he can do now. What I can also say is that this fight will end in a way that you will never be able to predict. Having gotten that interesting golem killer of all time, am I now able to get all 3 life alloy ores. Scorion needs the golem pick to be mine. Chronic ore is from beating Pyrogen. And Prenelumulumabumabulum ore is from something. I think it's from after Plan, but these details don't interest me, as all of these in the end only add up to things interesting for non-melee, which is the only viable choice anyways. So let's see me dig tunnels through the entire Iceborne to find the far and few between chronic ore clusters despite Pyrogen having been defeated quite a while ago. After that, something mightily interesting happened in form of a Martian invasion. It doesn't give anything interesting, but it's neat. So let's go from another planet to the entirety of space. The Lunatic Cultist is the last hurdle to the Moonlord. I can say the Lunatic Cultist is sure interesting. Before I tried him, did I give our other space fellow another chance. Astrum Aureus has interesting AI that forces you to at all time be in the air, as he will jump over you and then plummet down. So if you stand on the ground, we will not have enough time, even with a dash, to escape that in time. Another interesting thing are his homing projectiles that have such an interesting lifespan that they survive sometimes long enough to be active during another wave. And when they say homing, they sure mean homing. Now also, just to prove a point, did for one fight go to the best defensive setup you can have at this point. And this felt neither tanky nor like a real class. Calamity bosses have interesting amounts of HP, doing interesting amounts of damage, and having interesting amounts of projectiles that make tanking not viable. What I also could do at this point is the Empress of Light, and while my first ever real attempt at her was going okay, with me getting to the arena fast enough to be at full health during this fight, did I not know all the interesting attack patterns of this modded feeling boss. So modded that I don't think there are any changes at all to her from ZENITH or Calamity, with the exception of one. Wherever it may come from, the interesting change I encountered was that I got the Terror Prison despite fighting her at night. Oh, and also that Calamity removed the soaring insignia completely from the game. It was meant as this accessory that gives you nothing but movability, when you are willing to give up an entire accessory slot for that. And yet the mod that forces you to be as mobile as possible had the interesting idea of instead turning into an almost downgrade of a pre-hard mode item in form of the Harpy Ring. Now, on my second ever real attempt at her, can I say that this is an interesting addition to base Terraria, but I won't take on the interesting challenge of Daytime Empress, as it just wastes time for no gain. This meant there are now only 2 bosses left to this, so let's talk about the Lunatic Cultist. It didn't take long to realize that I will need as much space as possible for this fight, so I used the Rod of Harmony to teleport out to the old Desert Scourge arena that was next to the dungeon, and then the real fight began. Calamity has this interesting idea of Terraria being a game with Toho level of character control, and I can tell you right now, it has not. All projectors from the cultists are faster than you, and homing. The most interesting part is just how much faster and how strongly homing they are. The formerly move in a straight line Istis has gotten the interesting change of now being so strongly homing and so fast that if it catches up to you, will swim back and forth on top of you because you are too slow for its momentum. The other projectiles are slower and less homing, but gotten the interesting trait of coming in higher quantity. That means they usually cut off half the arena with a hitbox wall. In addition is there also the interesting thing of what the lifespan of all these projectiles is, which sure is interesting. But then there is summoning, and I'm convinced that the interesting change to that is that it is impossible to stop the summoning. That by itself isn't anything special, as I for the longest time didn't even know you could stop it anyways, and beating the dragon was never a problem. Now the other interesting change to this is that I for the first time have seen that the summoning can summon more than just a dragon, if that one is still alive during the next summoning. But that aside, as a dragon of course, due to interesting divine choices, is twice as fast as you will be able at this point. So there's a very specific way to dash dodge it that you just need to get used to. All of this makes this fight very interesting indeed. So interesting that I first took down SonicFan69 due to his signature spin dash that made the fight just a stand there and attack. This didn't give me anything relevant. So after that, I was back to the Lunatic Cultist, and just being good at the game while getting lucky. And yes, that interesting strategy of being lucky is required, but that is one thing I will talk about in my sum up video. With the cultist being gone is a pillar time, and where I did forget to record that, does it go like this. The interesting word generation change of the ZENITH makes the pillar spawn deep underground. That is indeed a good thing, as most pillar enemies can't do anything underground. Another interesting change thanks to Calamity is that pillar enemies now drop their respective fragments. So I did sit there and simply grind off fragments for a bit to never have to do this event again. But that's all the interesting changes to the pillars. There are some new pillar drops from Thorium and Calamity, but those are only interesting if you aren't melee. The only thing of interest to me at this point was solar fragments for the solar eruption. That means it's time for the Moonlord, and his most interesting change is that he's now a ghost. No, actually, that's just normal AI as the Moonlord occupies the background. You can do interesting things like this when your arena is warm. The actual interesting addition to this by the ZENITH is that the Phantasm Death Ray now spews out mutant boulders, and for that reason did I at first think that it would be best to be in this indoor arenas. I could make the ceiling so that I could not only stop the death ray, but also trap the moon borders up there. What is maybe a Calamity or just normal ZENITH thing is, however, the interesting change is the true eyes no longer doing Phantasm Death Ray, but instead spamming out moon borders around them. So the actual best way of fighting Moonlord is high up in the air. The moon borders can't bounce up to. All of this is interesting enough on its own, but Calamity also makes it so that when the true eyes pop out, they still stay active on the Moonlord, which has the interesting consequence of you needing to deal with more and more projectiles the longer this fight went on. The final interesting change to Moonlord is that he has a visual bug to his HP, refilling when the heart pops open. It still has only half of his total HP, but until I beat him, did I not realize how close I got in many attempts. The final thing I have to say is that you pretty much need the Rod of Harmony. The Phantasm Death Ray has, thanks to Death Mode, the interesting change of going full circle, but you will rarely be able to easily circle around the head, so be ready for when the beam comes and teleport on the Moonlord's other side, and then again back through the ray, followed by using the rod to reposition yourself. This now means hard mode is finally done. At first did I not even consider making a sum up video on my thoughts, but playing through hard mode made me realize that I have some opinions that might be quite controversial, and it does seem like a good way to end the hardest Terraria challenge. I know that there are some missing recordings, so I took some more time for this than shown, and there are some deaths missing, but it should be not too many. As I did in the first video, do I have some stats and description? Will I show deaths new to hard mode, and the total deaths I got to any one thing, as well as adding up the total deaths and time of pre-hard mode and hard mode for those who are interested. All that is now left is Godseeker mode, as it is called on the official Calamity wiki. Whatever even makes it more official than the fandom. Probably the part where what's written in it isn't also including 17 billion other recipes that never existed. Oh, and the funny thing about the credits. They seem to break when you zoom in. They probably never expected you to be zoomed in when you fight the Moonlord. Or it was the act of zooming itself that broke them. But that means here are some fuddy credits where only one of the sprites is correctly sized for these images.